Hi, Patrick, and good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, thank you very much. I invited you for this beautiful talk on phenomenology in psychology,
Thank
and
you for inviting me.
yeah, so thank you very much. But we will begin with your introduction. Though I know you, but I want you to introduce yourself for the viewers who will be watching this YouTube video.
For sure. So I am a research psychologist in the psychology department at Lund University. I study psychology from the fields of ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory, which holds quite different assumptions to what I guess I'll call mainstream psychology, which is usually like cognitivism, basically. And we'll be talking a little bit about that today on the topic of phenomenology. Um, and yeah, I don't want to get into the subject matter too quickly. So yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah,
And I guess for transparency's sake, I know Aser through the social resilience research group network. Um, and yeah, that's how we have come into contact.
yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, we are working on social resilience together, and it is very nice to have you here. And well, I mean, this topic, phenomenology, it has always been to my interest because I spent few years in working on phenomenological studies, and I also practiced it in my research as well. But interestingly, I had a chance to teach in psychology departments in Pakistan. So I felt that phenomenology in psychology is somehow a little ignored field, or maybe it has not get that attention before. So that's why I think it is important to talk about it. So my first basic question would be, what do you think? What is phenomenology in psychology?
Well, so the way that I've come in contact with phenomenology is basically as a philosophical approach. So you'd think that it would match up well with what psychology aims to explain, which is the behavior of the individual. But well, so phenomenology is trying to study the experience of human beings, the first person perspective of a human being. So you'd think that psychologists would be all over this, but as you mentioned, Asser, there is a lot of reluctance in, again, what I'll call mainstream psychology, which is more the cognitivist perspective of psychology, which has dominated for a while now. And I think the main reason there is this sort of reluctance from mainstream psychology stems from like the philosophical assumptions about what psychology as a science should be doing. So I relate this back to the sort of decision that stems from an approach called positivism. So positivism assumes that there is a real world out there that we're trying to figure out. But positivism also says that while we're doing that, we can't rely on the subjective experiences of humans. We have to have objective knowledge. And I think that these assumptions about objectivity and subjectivity have followed into the sort of cognitivist mainstream psychology today. So what this means is that and at least in my trainings, I'm also trained in like the traditional approaches, except for what I'm studying now. And I mean, we were absolutely told that like, well, you can't really trust what one person has seen from a situation that they're in because it's subjective. Another person would see it differently, so we can't trust it. So this sort of um, non-trust in what you then would have to call a subjective account is surely one of the large reasons why we don't see a lot of phenomenology either as like a general approach in psychology or mixed into the methods or assumptions that psychological background theories work with. And this is also why I think this topic is very interesting, because the approach to psychology that I use, ecological psychology, is, amongst other things, rooted in phenomenology and rooted in Merleau-Ponty. So ecological psychology does, in fact, take into account phenomenology. And I mean, we perhaps won't get into the philosophical details here, but and the reason for that is that in ecological psychology, we don't take this divide, objective, subjective, as something that you can do with the world. It's not a good division of the world. And a lot of our assumptions mean that you can't divide up the world like that. What we want to explain is the perception and action of human beings, or the behavior of an individual. But this includes perception, and it includes the individual perception of a human being. So in the broadest terms, there are, and of course, not only ecological psychology, there are other approaches that also invite phenomenological analysis and these kinds of things to psychology, but I'll stick to what I know and just talk about ecological psychology.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, okay. I just get one point from what you have said now. That do you think that mainstream psychology actually rely more upon objective evidences?
Well, so I don't think that you really can have that in the way that objectivity is used. To me, objectivity is just like the founder of ecological psychology, James Gibson, said about it, is that it's a pole of attention. I understand what you mean. You mean a detached perspective, but it is just that. It's a perspective, and it's not privileged in any way. It's a perspective like any subjective perspective would be. So when it comes to this question, because if you, in psychology, I guess mostly you wouldn't really have the strict positivist assumption that, I mean, it's mixed anyways, but you would mostly go by another approach called critical realism. And in critical realism, yes, you assume that there's like an objective world out there or a real world that you're trying to understand, but you can come differently close in doing so. And using different methods and from different fields within science, you can come differently close to this sort of objective reality. So again, to answer that question, it depends on what you assume, how you think you can cut up the world. So I think we should abandon the idea that we can divide up the world in objective and subjective. Rather, we should have a bit more of a pragmatic approach and say that, well, what other people would call subjective accounts of situations or phenomenon can be really useful, and we should use them for that, and they should rightfully get credit for that. Whereas, yeah, quantification, even sometimes reductionism, reducing things to their basic building blocks, can be useful. But as, you know, only using one will miss a lot, and we shouldn't do that. We should have a lot of tools and use it to figure out how to explain whatever it is that we want to explain.
Yeah, great. So you think that we should not have a divide of objective and subjective world, and we should approach it the way we see the data is coming through, or the way we conceptualize our research. So I mean, there must be then some epistemological position of the researcher when he or she is going to do a research. Mostly in psychology, it is considered that we are going to explore two words. First is a psychological word that is more individual, and second is social word that is more between person and environment. So do you think that while doing phenomenology in psychology, the researchers or the novice researchers coming from mainstream psychology, they can have faced some barriers while doing phenomenology in psychology?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, because I think what actually happens, I hope I'll be able to answer your question through this explanation, but what tends to happen in mainstream psychology is that we want to, the main goal is to explain the behavior of the individual, but we do that by aggregating data by groups. So we're looking at trends of groups, averages, medians, and then we do statistics on those group values rather than the individual values. So what happens is that if you could call one data point from one individual as subjective data point, then even at that very liberal definition of a subjective point of view, it's lost. Because we do math on it that erases those differences. And in fact, I mean, a lot of statistics is based on this. How far out on the bell curve do you end up? Or does your group end up? And, you know, if two groups are sufficiently different from each other, then we say that there's a reliable difference or a statistical difference. So I think that and I mean, so this again, this is using just thinking about the experiment as a quantifiable, using a quantifying methodology. If we then take this step out to qualitative methodologies, of course, there's huge variety in these, but even if you take such an account, the quantitative side tends not to read the qualitative literature. So even if we do have accounts from qualitative methodologies from subjective experiences, they tend not really to be used or to be referenced, or there's no cross or very little cross-pollination between the two approaches. So that's problematic. But I think that if I then stick to the mainstream approach to psychology, the largest barrier, I think, is this disappearance of individual differences because of how we aggregate data and compute statistics and other math on our groups. Or sorry, on our individuals. With that said, so this is where, from my perspective, I mentioned I used ecological psychology and a perspective called, or a bunch of theories called, dynamic systems theory. And I have become convinced that dynamic systems theory, though we're still living in the realm of like quantitative methodologies and such things, we can still preserve individual variation and describe our data on the group level as well. So to me, dynamic systems theory, although a little bit more complicated perhaps in terms of, let's say, using differential equations or difference equations, or equations that do not resemble the general linear model which you use in statistics, we have the possibility from our perspective to both look at what each individual does, if that would count as subjective, I'm unsure of, but at least we wouldn't discard or average away what is happening within one individual over time. And that I think is important, because again, it's about, I think it's okay for psychology to take group averages and this stuff, of course, and I do it myself in my research, but it's important to me not to lose sight of the fact that individual variation isn't error, isn't unexplainable, or whatever the defense might be to create averages, but rather individual differences are interesting. And I mean, I build this also on feminist theory, like Audre Lorde, writing about differences as something that is interesting and worthwhile, and not something that we should be afraid of or discard, or to create discord between people.
Yeah, good. So individual differences, that is interesting point, because I know that The students I have supervised while doing, who were doing qualitative research, particularly interpretive phenomenological analysis, sometimes I found them struggling with this top-down and bottom-up approaches to see the data. And I see that they still have a yardstick in their hands that
Hmm.
they use to measure everybody with the same yardstick. So then they are most likely ignoring the individual differences and the individual context, of course, the person environment interactions. Okay, so uh, in phenomenological research, for example, if novice students or masters or PhD students who opt to do qualitative psychology in somewhat way, do you think that this important challenge to understand individual differences that can be overcome by through any mean?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you're, I think once you take the step over to qualitative methods, if we can ignore dynamic systems theory for a little while, I'd say that using qualitative methodologies are excellent at bringing out these individual perspectives, and that they are uh, meaningful, give insights that otherwise a quantitative perspective wouldn't. Excuse me. So I think you're absolutely right in bringing that up. That and I hope that this resonates with what I said earlier. That this depends on what you want to study and how you want to explain your findings. And if you want to stick to a phenomenological explanation, then I think you have a much larger chance doing that with a qualitative approach, because usually qualitative approaches fall more in line with what we call post-positivist, um, well, philosophical assumptions at least. And post-positivism is essentially a reaction against positivism. So it rejects that there is, in different ways, but it rejects that there is this objective world out there. Or even if there is one, it doesn't matter, because we get, any knowledge we get is through subjective means. So it doesn't really matter. So, and there are variations within that as well. But um, yeah, so this is where sort of qualitative methodologies for me hold a lot of interest and meaning, because they not only preserve individual differences, but they value them. So you look at them and you examine them, as opposed to then, let's say, mainstream quantitative approaches, which, yeah, averages them away and doesn't see them as really that interesting information in and of themselves. I should mention that all statistical testing relies on variation. So there's almost this duality as well in quantitative psychology that I find fascinating, that we need the individual variation to build a statistical model, but we also need to kind of ignore it when we're looking at the data or what the data is telling us. So I find that interesting. But yeah, sorry, back to your point. Absolutely, qualitative methodologies would be the way to go, or come join me in ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory, I guess.
Yeah, ecological psychology. Yeah. Okay, you want more people to join ecology.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Do you think there are not too many people who are in ecological psychology?
No, it's relatively speaking, it's a very small subset of psychologists that know ecological psychology. Gibson's ecological psychology is what I refer to when I say ecological psychology. And I mean, there are a couple of schools that have programs in this approach. So I finished my doctorate in University of Cincinnati. They have a group of wonderful professors and a really great program to learn about ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory. There's another one in University of Connecticut. But beyond those two larger programs, you have research groups around Europe and around the US and elsewhere. But yeah, the field is very small compared to mainstream psychology or cognitivist approaches and things like that.
All right. Okay. One thing that I found challenging, it is about meaning making process. For example, in phenomenology, in psychology. For example, we are doing interviews, and then a question comes that how do we know that the meaning making that the participant or the interview is giving to us, how do we validate it that it is correct or it is has the same meaning what the participant is saying?
Um, I think the idea of validation isn't isn't always that interesting. So I'd say in my own research, my because we still do some statistics and group blah blah, this is where we kind of say we get validity from. This idea with large sample sizes equaling validity is not entirely straightforward, but it's one of the ways in which we say it's not just one person doing it, it's a lot of people doing it. But I don't think that, so if you have an interview situation and you have one participant, I think that this demand of validity in the traditional sense is still rooted in some kind of positivist assumption that what one individual is saying can't be, it can be valuable to some extent, but it can't be, I don't know, the whole story or something like this. So we need someone else to say it too. Then we trust it. And I think this actually comes back to certainty. And if you want to understand why we need certainty, we have to talk about the Enlightenment. So let's skip that for now. Excuse me. But I'd say that in the case of an interview with one person, I personally, if I read such an account, let's say, as a person that is the receiver of your research, I am not personally that concerned with measures of validity, arguments of validity for that account. What I'm concerned with is, well, what is this? What does this interview tell me about experiences that I've had, experiences that I'm going through, experiences that I might never go through, that I nonetheless want to understand. So, so to me, yeah, it's I have a complicated relationship with validity, let's call it. But I don't think it's right to apply it blindly, let's say. And as a reader, I think you have responsibility in what you're reading. It's not just the producer of knowledge that has that responsibility. And on that note, actually, because we're bordering on the issue of here of transparency and reflexivity. So in my own research and from the ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory standpoint, we're not reflexive in our articles. We don't write what our position is and things like that. But what we do, where reflexivity, I think, has a huge part for us, is that we have such a close relationship to philosophers and philosophers of science that outside of doing articles, we continuously very critically reflect on what our theory is doing, what it's producing, how it's doing that, what the concepts really are doing. Are there discrepancies in ways we are describing things? Are we holding true to the you know, there's so much activity going on that I haven't seen in the same way in mainstream psychology. Um, and maybe we should be better at being transparent in our articles, but that's for the future, I guess. But to the point that we're talking about, the writer, to me, or the author, their responsibility is to be transparent. This is what we did. This is how we did it. This is, and of course, more qualitative methodologies and outside of psychology, people are much better at staking their claims. We believe in this, or I come from this kind of background, and things like that. And I think that's important. And then it's up to the reader to decide. Okay, well, this account, yeah, it might tell me something interesting, but do we have to see things as truthful and non-truthful? And I don't think so. I'm much more of a pragmatist here. Is it useful? Did I understand something reading this? So to me, even lying, yeah, but that can be, it can be still be an interesting story. And then I don't have to, maybe, I mean, in research it would be problematic, in law maybe. But in research like that, it's the utility that's important there.
Yeah, good. So two lessons, what the qualitative researcher or the psychology students opting to do phenomenology in psychology may carry with them is that number one, the qualitative researcher doing phenomenology does not have to go for the so-called generalization of the truths through quantifying the data or whatever the other objective measures they used to have in top-down studies. And second is that these conventional validation measures and techniques and strategies, they may not be very useful in phenomenology because we are exploring the person's perspective of his own word or her own word. So we cannot use those so-called validation yardsticks to understand that phenomena. That's what you mean?
That's exactly right. And I actually just the other day read a really nice quote from the literature in ecological psychology, but it rhymes well with the phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty, which is basically that you have both a world and an environment at the same time. But the world is a physical description of the layout of the land we see in front of us. But that's not where humans live. Humans live in an environment. So that's what we have to explain. And I think that distinction really gets at this idea of at least the phenomenological roots in ecological psychology.
Interesting. So in qualitative research, or we will say it phenomenological research, it is more important for the researcher to position him or herself at where he or she is, both in the way of their epistemological position, or also called philosophical position, and then also the methodological position. I mean, because they are the one who are at the same time a researcher and also the instrument of the research, because they are flexible in using their method as well. So they have to know their own position, and if they can do so, they may get an advantage to approach the participants. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Oh,
And I think this is true for quantitative psychology too, or quantitative research too.
yeah. But in somewhat way, the quantitative researchers they already have some control over their data. But in qualitative, maybe we have different types of data that is not always in numbers, or that may be quantified, or they may be used in statistical procedures. So quantitative researchers, they come through their hypothesis and they're pre-equipped with some statistical skills to understand data, and they have some yardsticks to see if the data is true or false or something. But in qualitative research, we don't have a kind of scale to know the true or false. So we have to understand the process or the phenomena. That's what I mean.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So I think these few questions would be helpful to understand phenomenology in psychology, and also that it is challenging, but also it is much needed.
I wholeheartedly agree.
And do you have any concluding remarks on phenomenology in psychology?
No, not really. Maybe one, which is to again, not to try to doubt too much what one's doing, but still keeping a critical eye on how one does that. And that's really difficult, but it's one of the things we try to teach students as they go through their university studies. So yeah, that will be my concluding thought. And thank you again for inviting me.
Yeah, great. Perfect. Thank you very much, Patrick. It is useful, and you know that I try to use my YouTube channel, and especially to address the students and the novice researchers in psychology and other social sciences fields, because I feel that most of the young students and researchers, they need some insight from the real researchers, not the books always. So I hope this will help them. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.